I'm David Damrosch. I'm here with my colleague Katerina Pohotsky to probe the mystery of Leo Spitzer's surprising evocation of François Rabelais in his autobiographical essay, Linguistics and Literary History, probably written in 1945, published in 1948, a decade after he'd emigrated to the United States. I think you recall the beginning to that essay. Could you recall it for us?
Yes, so I think Spitzer says, I have chosen the autobiographical way because my personal situation in Europe 40 years ago was not, I believe, essentially different from the one with which I see the young scholars of today and in this country generally face. I chose to relate to you my own experiences also because the basic approach of the individual scholar, conditioned as it is by his first experiences, by his Erlebnis, as the Germans would say, determines his method. Methode ist Erlebnis, Gundolf has said. And in fact, I would advise every older scholar to tell his public the basic experiences underlying his methods, his Mein Kampf, as it were, without dictatorial connotations, of course.
What on earth could Spitzer have meant by this deadpan comparison of himself to Hitler? Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht is frankly astonished in his essay on Spitzer, Methode ist Erlebnis, a title drawn from this very passage in his book Vom Leben und Sterben der großen Romanisten, on the life and death of the great Romanists. Gumbrecht says that in 1948, Spitzer hadn't even begun to take account of what had really gone on in Nazi Germany. This can't be true, can it? He was intensely aware of what was going on with the Nazis who had expelled him in 1933. Something else has to be happening, and that something else takes him back to Rabelais. It was French culture that originally led him into literary studies. As he tells us, I had decided to study French philology because in my native Vienna, the gay and orderly, skeptic and sentimental, Catholic and pagan Vienna of yore was filled with adoration of the French way of life. The moment when the curtain rose on a French play given by a French troupe, and the valet, in a knowing accent of psychological alertness, with his rich, poised voice, pronounced the words, Madame est servie, was a delight to my heart. But now, in the shadow of the Nazi occupation of France, he returns to his philological roots to make sense of this disaster. And he illustrates his method by inviting us to read a passage from Rabelais. This is the beginning of the inscription over the gateway to the Abbé de Télème at the end of the first volume of Gargantua and Pantagruel. And here's what he asks us to say. Just listen to the inscription on the Abbé de Télème, that Renaissance convent of his shaping, which Rabelais excludes the hypocrites. And he quotes 8 lines all in French, without even giving us a translation. What might it have been like in English for a 17th century reader?
Well, there is actually a rollicking early translation by Sir Thomas Urquhart from 1653, which goes like this. Here enter not vile bigots, hypocrites, externally devoted apes, base knights, puffed up wry-necked beasts, worse than the Huns or Ostrogoths, forerunners of baboons, cursed snakes, dissembled varlets, seeming saints, slipshod cuffards, beggars pretending once, fat chaff-cats smell, feast knockers, stultish gulls, outstrutting clusterfusts, contentious bulls, fomenters of divisions and debates, elsewhere, not here, make sale of your deceits.
It's a great passage, and I think it does justice to Rabelais. It's rollicking, it's lively, it's full of new words, which Spitzer loves. It's hilarious. It's no horror here. There's no thing disturbing. It's funny. But Spitzer reads it rather differently than you just read it, and as we normally would. He comments, having quoted the French lines, as follows. He says, the prosaic commentators of the Lefranc edition would explain that this kind of rather mediocre poetry is derived from the popular genre of the cri, the harangue of a barker, overloaded with devices of the rhétoriqueur school. But I, says Spitzer, can never read these lines without being frightened. I am shaken in this very moment by the horror emanating from this accumulation of FL and GOT clusters, of sounds which in themselves, taken separately, are quite harmless, but of words grouped together, bristling with Rabelais' hatred of hypocrisy, that greatest of crimes against life. Écrit, yes, but in a more extensive meaning of the word, it is the gigantic voice of Rabelais which cries to us directly across the gulf of the centuries, as shattering now is at the hour when Rabelais begot these word monsters. Really? Shaken by the accumulation of FL and GOT clusters? Were you shaken when you were reading this?
Not really.
I wasn't either. Not when I read it originally, not the first few times I read Spitzer's essay. I don't think anyone was reading Rabelais this way, not even and not least Spitzer's own teachers in fin de siècle Vienna. I happen to have a lavishly illustrated edition from 1897, published in Paris, with dozens of color plates by a well-known artist, Jules Garnier, and he has a full-page illustration of the Abbé. And this is what his illustration looks like. It's a world of elegance. These statues of the three naked graces there, men and women strolling through this beautiful garden, exchanging elegant discourse. I'm sure they've been eating well. I'm sure they're sleeping well together afterwards. It's a beautiful sort of humane environment of exchange and discourse. That's how at least it would have looked. And I asked you to come if you could give us a sense of how it might have sounded. And I thought you'd be the perfect person to ask, since you grew up in Austria yourself. You wrote your first dissertation in French at the University of Vienna in Spitzer's old department. So I imagine you could give us a sense of how might this have sounded in Spitzer's day to a French professor reading these lines.
A French professor would probably have read it very slowly in a rather declamatory style, probably filtered by 17th century French tragédie classique, perhaps something that sounded a little bit like Racine's Phèdre when she comes on stage for the very first time and says to her servant, "N'allons point plus avant, arrêtons, chère nonne." Perhaps something like that. So I will try to read the 8 lines that you mentioned in a style that Spitzer would probably have heard in high school or at the university. Si n'entrez pas, hypocrite bigot, vieux matagot, marmiteux, boursouflé, torcol, badaud, plus que n'était l'ego, ni ostrogoth, précurseur des magots, airs, cagots, cafards empantouflés, gueux mitouflés, frappards écorniflés, béflés, enflés, fagoteurs de tabus, tirez ailleurs pour vendre vos abus.
Well, that's amazing. But there's certainly no horror there. It's more like the urbane mockery we'd find in the Magic Flute that Mozart wrote in his own gay and orderly Vienna 100 years earlier, when the wise Sarastro drives the evil Monostatos out of his Masonic temple of wisdom. But then I realized that Spitzer returns to Rabelais several pages later in his essay, and here he gives us the key to his reading of the Abelais inscription. He asks, now, who are the descendants of Rabelais? In our own time, he says, with Ferdinand Céline, who can build a whole book out of invectives against the Jews, bagatelle pour un massacre. We may see language exceed its boundaries. Spitzer says the following example makes a pseudo-Rabelaisian effect and can be compared with the apocalyptic inscription over the portal of Thelem. And no one before Spitzer had ever thought that inscription was apocalyptic. But here are the lines that Spitzer quotes from Céline in French, again without translation. Pensée sociale, cela veut dire dans la pratique, un terme bien cru, pensée juif, pour les juifs, par les juifs, sous les juifs, rien d'autre. Tout le surplus immense des mots, le vrombissant verbiage sociolitico, humanitaire, scientifique, tout le cosmique carafouillage de l'impératif despotique juif n'est que l'enrobage mirailleux, le charabia fatras poussif, le sauce orientale, précisant collé de rien, la fricassée terminologique pour rire, pour l'adulation des avelis blancs, ivrons rampants, intouchables, quand se foutre, à pique vertueux, son mythifiant, son bafouet carré. Spitzer comments, here the word world is really only a world of noisy words, clanking sounds, covering with their noise the fear and rage of modern man, lonely in the doomed modern world. Words, he says, in reality fall apart. This is really a voyage au bout du monde, not the Oracle of Bach book, where Rabelais' heroes go to drink, but to chaos, to the end of language as an expression of thought. And let's note that Spitzer doesn't actually ask us to read the passage, but to hear it. Listen, he says, to the passage, si n'entrez pas hypocrite, and so on. Now, what might it be like if we were to hear the passage the way he hears it through Céline's Nazi-era French?
Well, it might sound much more aggressive. It would sound probably much more choppy, much faster. Of course, no declamatory style there, nothing slow.
And possibly closer to Rabelais' own time?
Possibly closer to Rabelais' own time, definitely, which was 100 years, of course, before the tragédie classique emerged. So it might have sounded something like that. Si n'entrez pas, hypocrite, bigot, vieux matagot, marmiteux, boursouflé, torcou, badot, plus qu'un est élégant, ni ostrogot, précurseur des magots, cagot, cafard, empantouflé, gueumitouflé, frappards écorniflés, béflés, enflés, fagoteurs de tabus, tirez ailleurs pour vendre vos abus.
Well, I can never hear the passage read that way without being frightened in this very moment by those FL and GOT clusters. And that, I think, is how Spitzer means us to hear it. In this respect, this essay has a lot in common with another wartime product, The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, volume written by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno during these same years in exile in the United States. And their theme is that the Enlightenment discourse taken wrong leads us to Hitler. And I think that Spitzer as well has his version of this claim, that the dialectic of Renaissance humanism taken wrong can lead us from the Abbaye de Thélème down to Auschwitz. This, I think, is the moral of the story, the solution to the mystery of his strange use of Rabelais in relation to Mein Kampf, as it were, with the dictatorial connotations that he reads via Céline. And this is the challenge, I think, that he offers us, to recover through philology the real feel of the words that we read, their real meaning, how they can be used, how they can be used against people. And he's not just importing anti-Semitism into poor humanist Rabelais. As the passage goes on beyond the lines he quotes over the Abbaye de Thélème, the poem enumerates the kinds of hypocrites who are to be excluded from the Abbaye. And these include scribes, Pharisees, usurers, and at the climax of the poem, all those who do not treasure the sacred word of the gospel. So I think this is really the dialectic of Renaissance humanism as we see it in dark times. This is Spitzer's reaction to the collapse of European civilization and his hope that a kind of resistance philology can recover the moral sense that we've been losing in the dark times he's living through. Thank you so much, Katrina, for coming and helping to perform these versions of this passage, and thank you all for listening in.